Hello, and welcome to this second live stream of Dynamic Range Day 2022. My guest is Justin Gray from Immersive Mastering, and we're going to be talking about particularly the dynamics of Dolby Atmos, which you probably know is, Atmos has been around for years in cinemas, but in the last year has kind of exploded into people's awareness because Apple now allow you to stream it using Apple Music. You can plug into an Apple TV and a sound bar or a surround system and get full Atmos surround for the things that you're watching or listening to. And you can even listen to it on earbuds if you like. And we're going to talk about why that is so interesting. So Justin, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you. And hello, everybody.
And before we go any further, if people are watching this, if you could just drop a message into the comments saying hello and check that you can hear both of us and see us okay, that would be good just before we embark into too much of an in-depth thing. While we do that, Justin, maybe you could just kind of briefly introduce yourself and Immersive Mastering and talk about how you got into immersive and surround. I mean, was that a goal for you from the beginning, or is that something you kind of came to?
Absolutely. So my background in the engineering world is as a mixing engineer, for many years. Also as a bassist and producer, that's sort of like where my musical journey begins. But as a stereo mastering engineer for the better part of the last decade, stereo mastering has been an art that I've been dedicated to as our community is. And when it comes to immersive audio, I was always, it's sort of a linear process for me. I've always been, as a listener, very much dedicated to listening to soundtracks and DVDs and the SACDs in 5.1. And to somewhat justify having my 5.1 system, I would also do a lot of stem prep and pre-mixing for film. So composer friends or things along those lines, instead of just mixing in stereo, say, well, I'd talk to the remixer and say, well, I can deliver in 5.1 if that's okay with you, and just sort of do it. It was never sort of a formal recommendation. I'm not a soundstage, but they were always happy to receive those stems and do a little less work. So I've always been very, very inspired by the idea of surround sound, which is also referred to as immersive audio. And so when the advent of Dolby Atmos, when Dolby Atmos when I became aware of it, the first time that I had a chance to hear it, of course, the addition of height channels and a 7.1 bed, or in my case, a 9.1 bed, is inspiring. I mean, it's quite a profound experience. But as with previous surround formats, there's always of course, this is awesome, but where does this go? And when I had the chance to finally learn what technology was available for basically non-speaker dedicated playback, object-based audio, the ability for this to actually translate to users in flexible ways, that's when I perked up. This is about 4 years ago. And quite frankly, about 4 years ago, I then started the process. I said to myself, this is going to happen. It's because it is meaningful. I already knew that. Anyone who's had a chance to listen to music in 5.1 or even quad before that has had that experience, has said, wow, this is quite profound. And, it just translates the music in a meaningful way. And so the ability to see that Avid was on board, Apple maybe was going to be on board, Tidal was in the distant horizon at that point, I said, that this is another real attempt at bringing meaningful musical experiences to people. And I think that Dolby's really thought it out. And they've also had almost like a decade, close to a decade of film experience now to really iron this thing out, to really figure out how to use this technology. And so everywhere from binaural up to the speaker, I realized that this was going to be a thing. So I started investing. I started to hang speakers from the ceiling and figure things out. I had all of this set up and calibrated well before the technology was working for music. And quite frankly, I just started working on projects that I was the producer of, or my own projects, which was one that I shared the other day at the AES conference, just to explore aesthetics and start to get into the idea of, this is how I'd like to make music as a mix engineer. But right from the very beginning, I designed it in the studio, and I kept mastering in mind. And we'll talk about that. But I'm a mastering engineer. I love my working on music through that lens and through that capacity. And so, yeah, it's been a linear process, not something where, like, just because Apple started it 9 months ago, I just threw up a bunch of speakers. It's been a process because I really believe in it. I really believe that there's massive potential for meaningful music.
Yeah, that's very cool. I mean, I kind of feel the same way, honestly. Oh, I can hear some bill through from your end.
Okay, just a sec here. This is a little better?
Let me try that. No.
There's a little echo?
Yeah.
Is this any better?
1, 2. It's echo on me.
It's echoing. No, that's odd.
Not to worry. I'll just ignore it. Just check your settings. There's a button that says
I saw that. Yeah,
in the audio settings, you can echo cancellation. Is that ticked?
It is, and I just clicked it again. So let's see if that helps. Does that help?
1, 2. Yes.
Okay, might have just turned off.
Okay, yeah, very cool to hear how you got into it. I've also had a lot of experience in 5.1 and completely agree with you about the, just what a great experience it is. And yeah, I'm really excited by the possibilities of Atmos. But for anybody listening who's kind of not come across Atmos before, one thing you guys could do is head over to themasteringshow.com, because we just did a whole podcast episode about Atmos and particularly mastering for Atmos. But just very briefly, I mean, Justin mentioned there that it is an object-based format, which basically means, so with stereo and with 5.1 and with 7.1, when you export the final project, you basically have one file per speaker. So, and the way that gets played back is that those files come out of the specific speaker. So if somebody has their speaker behind the TV or under the couch, that's where the audio comes from. And it's kind of, I'd like to think of it, it's effectively like it's been bounced into those final file formats. With Dolby Atmos, you have an ADM file, which can contain a bed that has those speaker-specific audio channels embedded in it, but it can also have objects, which are basically audio files with instructions that I'm supposed to play back from above your head or from behind you, or I'm supposed to be circling around your head, whatever that might be. And when that file gets played back for the user, those instructions are rendered to the best of the ability of the playback system. So if you have a 9.1.4 system, you're going to get full Atmos playback. If you have a 5.1 surround setup, you're going to get really good 5.1 surround sound. And if you have a pair of Apple earbuds or even a pair of headphones, don't have to be Apple specific hardware necessarily, you will get a binaural experience where the renderer tries to emulate as best it can how things sound to us in real life. So when a plane flies overhead, there's a delay between the time it takes for the sound to reach our ears, but also the shape of our head and the shape of our ears changes that sound. And our brains, because they've been hearing that since we were born, are really good at decoding those clues and understanding where the sound came from. So the binaural render of Dolby Atmos can attempt to emulate that and give us the impression that things are coming from above our head or behind or even maybe in front of us. And it can be surprisingly effective. So that, I think you're right, Justin. That for me is the exciting thing, is that suddenly you don't have to rely on the fact that somebody might have an Atmos system or a 5.1 system to know they're getting a bigger experience than straight stereo, because all they need is a pair of headphones. The other thing that I'm really interested in and really excited, and why I'm talking to you now about it today on Dynamic Range Day, is the way that loudness is handled in Atmos. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how that works and how it's different from what we're used to seeing in stereo.
Absolutely. So one of the first things to recognize is that this music is being produced, immersive audio. And again, we'll hone in on Dolby Atmos, but immersive audio is referring to multiple formats. But and frankly, the behavior that we're talking about here in Dolby Atmos, it does apply to Auro 3D. It does apply to Sony 360. It does apply to film formats like IMAX and DTS, etc., or DTX. So but Atmos is a logical one, and especially from a music standpoint, to use as the center. When we're producing music in multiple channels, whether or not it's speaker agnostic, we're producing music in multiple channels. When that information has to get summed down to 2 channels, let's take the binaural experience as the one we're discussing. That's a lot of information going into a very small space, just like a lake meeting a river, or an ocean meeting a river. The volume goes up and the water level rises and the intensity increases. And so as a result of that, when we're working in this multi-channel format, in this multi-channel environment, we have to be considering all the time that, since headphones is essentially the smallest of the streams that everything will be summed to in this binaural environment, and not only that, probably the most common and one of the most easily accessible streams for listening to this format, that the dynamic range is defined at the beginning in the speaker format, but also is in direct relation to the headroom that exists when we're folding down to stereo. Everyone knows this. You have a mix, everything's sitting really nice, and then you look at your master bus and it's all, so take that, and also that's the same concept. As a result, when working in a speaker format, quite frankly, if we happen to, let's say, be working in the range of -20 LUFS, that will translate most likely on average, but it depends. There's a bunch of factors, but let's say 4 decibels louder. So about -16 LUFS. And that will be in the range without mastering and without some very specific production decisions. That'll be about as loud as you could get that file on your best day. Now, so that sounds like a limitation, but it's also an opportunity. And what the opportunity is since that is essentially the range of the threshold, and I'm not saying we'll talk about numbers specifically, but the idea that this summation of the parts has a limit, and that limit is so much lower than the limits of stereo, like just significantly lower. And quite frankly, without having an uninspiring multi-channel experience, by limiting it so far that maybe I could probably take some limited pink noise and reach LUFS targets that match stereo, and I'm not saying that might not be some art experiment to do, but in the cases of commercial music or creative music forms, instrumental music, etc., creating music in this multi-channel environment to sound the way we want it to essentially means that the headroom is limited to, I would say, the loudest that I've seen a really great sounding mix is in the binaural range is maybe -13, and that would be that's like you really worked for it, and it's a very specific piece of music. Now, if someone might say, I reached -12, okay, fine. Regardless, we're not talking about -7. We're not talking about -6, -9. We all know that due to the nature of the loudness wars, things get pushed there all often. In this world, a really healthy mix, something sounding beautiful, is sitting around in the headphone format, -15, -16. Surprise, a number that we've all been suggesting for music listening for quite some time, a number that we've decided as a community is a reasonable normalization target. So suddenly it just happens. I mean, it's not just happens, it's technology's been designed this way, but that the binaural fold down sort of range of a mastered audio file is going to be sitting right where we've all dreamed of being able to deliver significant amounts of stereo music. Now, so here's the thing though. If I play back my binaural audio file, let's say it's sitting at -15, and I played the stereo master, which was delivered to me at -9, of course we have a differentiation there. And if a client listens to A and B, they're going to notice it. Quite frankly, they're going to need to be warned to turn down their headphones a little bit for the stereo file. And this is where normalization comes in and saves the day. And Dolby, from day one, as well as Apple, as well as Amazon, I should say Amazon and Tidal, and Apple definitely opened the roof on this, but Tidal did first. And they have all agreed from the onset understanding that this music would be delivered quieter than stereo on the whole, that it would be normalized to, and that stereo would have to now play ball with the standards of immersive audio. And so if we're going to take immersive audio seriously and have it be effective and have users be inspired by it, which all of these organizations are dedicated to doing, I think they've proven that already, then we're going to have to normalize stereo down and Atmos up and find a happy medium. And so what happens when we're listening in headphones, and I'll go back to speakers afterwards, but I'm just going right to the chase here for the headphone part of it, because that to me is the end of the dynamic chain. That's actually where the peak dynamics can be decided, is through the binaural. Whether or not you're listening to it or not, it still is it's a factor.
And right now, it's where most people are hearing this stuff, right?
Yeah, and we'll continue to, whether it's in the future of VR, whether it's with music, whether etc. So it's going to continue to be that way. The headphones are going to get better and better, and people's, I think, environments for using headphones, I think, will only become more accessible and more inspiring. So we'll eventually all be running around with IDs on our head, like giant headphones, and feeling comfortable doing so. Odyssey. Sorry, I said it wrong. Anyways, to that point, it took a little bit of time right at the beginning, but they've all made massive strides. Amazon HD, Tidal HD, and Apple in getting the normalization practices to work, to the degree that when I take my phone, sorry, it's over here, and I am QCing my clients' files all the time, just seeing how this is working on all this. Like there's an album that came out today, a band that I delivered this week, Cannons. It's a full record in Atmos and 360. So Sony 360 as well. So Sony 360 will be on the other platforms, but we'll stay focused on Atmos for consistency right now. I go in right away and I'm always checking, making sure, I want to make sure that the behavior is working, and studying the sound check behavior on Apple, and studying how it's working, so that I can continue to, make sure that I'm delivering files that really work with the technology. And the fact is that when we go between stereo and Atmos, when it's done properly, the impact, the volume impact is the same, despite one being significantly, and I'm not going to talk about the stereo master that I was delivered, but it was louder, like significantly louder. It sounds great. It sounds awesome for stereo. I love the master. But in Atmos, what we're reminded is that when we actually do properly gain match, one of my favorite plugins of Perception AB, like when we properly listen to things and we gain match things together, we remove that audio perception of something being better or worse due to all those psychoacoustic effects. And it's proof that a file at minus 16 or 15 can indeed sound even more engaging, or equally engaging. Let's say equally is fair. Equally engaging to a file in stereo that is significantly louder. And I actually think that the potential that we should all be exploring here, which I know that you're down with, Ian, and I look forward to your thoughts on it, is there's actually potential there of once we do even the slate, that this file, which had more dynamic range, actually can sound even bigger, if we want to go there. I mean, I don't like the idea of comparing loudness and deciding something's better because of it, but quite frankly, there's more dynamic range in one of them. And when we even the slate for the playback volume properly, suddenly one becomes desirable, despite on paper one might think there's no way that these could compete. And so, yeah, I hope that's a decent explanation of it from the headphone standpoint. I do want to talk about the speaker standpoint, but we'll do that once we sort of wrap this up.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I saw a comment there from somebody just wanting to check those numbers for you, saying the mix ends with those numbers, the mix or the master delivered file. And I should say that there's one of the complications about Atmos, for people who haven't come across it before, is that it's less clear, the distinction between mixes and masters. If somebody sends an Atmos mix to be mastered, what happens is you import that ADM file into a DAW, and you basically get a stems version of the entire thing. So you don't get the mix in terms of the original, all the processing that was used. But for example, you'll get a guitar stem and effects and all the rest of it. And all of that, you'll be able to see all the object instructions, and those could be edited. So, the techniques are different. Rather than putting a compressor on a stereo bus or on a 5.1 output bus, you're processing objects within the mix. So yeah, when we talk about mixes and masters in Atmos, Juan, they are effectively equivalent. You take a mix file, somebody might master it in the sense that a mastering engineer gives that third-party objective opinion about it and maybe makes some adjustments to the EQ and the levels between songs, perhaps in the way that we're all familiar with. But then when that's exported back, it goes into another file that's identical. It's still a mix file. It's just a mix that has been mastered.
Well, actually, and I would actually say I made a mistake, Juan. They're all masters. Whatever gets delivered to the DSP is a master. And so I should have not used the word mix in that case. I would see it all as whatever gets delivered is the master. That's the master recording.
Which is kind of similar in the sense that when we get a stereo file for mastering, it's a stereo WAV file. You master it and you export it as another stereo WAV file, right? And either one of those could be used as a master. It's just that so there's a terminology issue. But in terms of the levels, what we're saying is, the actual levels will vary slightly, but depending on how many speakers you have. And the Dolby Atmos renderer has some pretty sophisticated level metering processing in there to tell the engineer what those levels are, where the peaks are, where the loudness units are. And what I've heard, I don't know whether you'd agree with this, Justin, is that let's just talk briefly. You've explained why this extra headroom is needed in an Atmos mix. You're basically saying this thing that could be played back on a 20 or 30 speakers in a cinema could also be played back on a stereo, on speakers, or on earbuds, or in a 5.1 setup. And so basically the renderer needs enough flexibility to be able to do that without adding extra processing, right? Yep. To get a clean render of the mix. Now, the guideline that Dolby offer for that is that your loudest song on an album should be at -18 LUFS. And I know that Universal Music, certainly, that is actually a delivery requirement. So I know people who have had masters or final mixes, however you want to term them, rejected because they were 0.2 dB above -18. Because if it's possible to deliver something louder, but when you do that, then you're going to, there's a limiter in the renderer that will protect from clipping. That is not designed as a musical tool, it's a safety tool, right? So the sound of that is unlikely to be good. So Universal have made the decision, okay, we want everything at -18, because then we know nothing is going to hit the limiter too hard when it gets rendered on any playback system, and everything is going to work well. And then the mastering engineer will balance everything else musically from that. And anybody who's been listening to me talk about dynamic range day and loudness for the last few years, well, that's what I recommend when you're mastering anyway. My suggestion is loudest bits at -10, scale everything back from there. And that's about as loud as you want to go. And you could have more dynamics if you wanted. So that technique works. And yeah, I just want to second what you said there, Justin, which is, for me, the thing that's exciting is because engineers have that headroom available, they're not under the same pressure that they might be when working in stereo to feel that everything has to be super loud. They're making use of those dynamics. So I would go further than you, Justin. You're being very diplomatic, I'm sure, because you have plenty of clients that you're doing immersive masters for, and also, you don't want to disparage anybody working in the stereo world. But for me, there are 5 albums on the Dynamic Range Day Award shortlist this year, all of which are Atmos specific. So the stereo masters of those albums are considerably louder. One of them, for example, is the last Dua Lipa album. That's a really hot master. Sounds pretty good considering how hot it is. The Atmos master is way, way lower. But when you flick between them on an Apple device, and anybody who's got an Apple device and wants to try this, you just need to, if you drag down the control center thing so that you can see the volume control for your earbuds. Long click on that volume control, there's a toggle button where you can enable and disable spatial audio. And providing you're streaming, if you've downloaded a file, it'll play the file you've downloaded. But if you're streaming this stuff, when you disable spatial, you will hear the stereo master exactly as it is on CD and everywhere else. When you enable spatial audio, you will hear the binaural render of the Atmos master. So basically, you're going between potentially very loud and more dynamic, which is typically where the Atmos masters are. For me, when I do that, I'm just loving it. You know, everybody who's doing this kind of work, like you were saying, has a stereo mix or master as a reference, and that's their, you know, what was it Emre said? You engage maximum respect mode. You know, that's the art right there. So whatever you do in Atmos has to sit perfectly well next to that. You know, it has to be, it's an Atmos rendition of the same piece of art. So you're not going to, I mean, maybe if the artist was there, you might do something wild and creative, but typically it's like, okay, we need to make a really satisfying Atmos version of this stereo version. But there are all those opportunities that the dynamics give you. And, you know, I don't think any of the albums on the shortlist this year sound dreadful in stereo, but there are examples out there where I listen to the stereo masters and they are so heavily distorted and so crushed. And then you switch to the Atmos version, it's just a breath of fresh air. And I'll let you talk again, Justin, see whether you agree with that and want to add any caveats. But yeah. I think the other thing I would say, just before I stop, for Dynamic Range Day fans, is just, you know, I've been saying this for years. You can achieve that kind of pressure, heavy limited, high density, aggressive sound if people want, without ramming everything up to -4 LUFS. So many people tell me, oh no, you need XYZ, you know, heavy limiting, heavy clipping, all the rest of it, to achieve the sound. But one of the first things I did today on Dynamic Range Day was post to the Facebook page the video for the soundtrack to the animated series Arcane, which is done by Imagine Dragons. Now, they're a band where their stereo stuff is really loud. And a bunch of people might tell you, well, that's because that's what they need for the sound. But the soundtrack for this animation, because it was aimed for broadcast and didn't have that kind of restriction, is mastered at, I think, -12, -13 LUFS. It still sounds exactly like Imagine Dragons. It still has all that intensity, all that power. It still has that kind of heavily limited drum sound. Everything is there, but it's been mastered with more dynamics. And the great thing about Atmos is it's just a kind of a continuous stream of albums that kind of prove this point for me. So I'll shut up now and let me.
No, I mean, there's a lot to unpack in some of the things you just said, and I am very inspired, even when we were preparing for this and our conversations the other day after the AES conference, by the way that you've perceived this format. I think that you're right there with its potentials, and of course, all of this comes down to a listening experience, right? This is all music. Regardless of whether there's this many speakers, mono all the way up to 9.1.6 and beyond, it's about impact. It's about listening. Everything. It's all about whether the music moves people. End of story. I mean, beyond that, the technology will continue to change. The music is what we need to focus on. And so, I'm going to move through what you did and try to remember the various things you talked about, because there's some really good ones. But now I want to pull back out to this -18 thing. Look, I am working in Atmos and 360 all day. This week, two different records were sort of, all day long, delivering to major labels and independents. I've been trying to engage the community here in Canada and work with as many people as possible as a mastering engineer and a mix engineer to just bring music into this format, quite frankly, because I love it and I believe in it and it inspires me and it inspires them in turn. But as a result, I've seen a lot of music. I think it's maybe in a range of, I probably have about 400 songs in the Atmos format at this point. And so I have some very strong opinions about that number. -18. When you're listening on a calibrated system, which means that it's been tuned to appropriately to your room, either 85 decibels, 79 decibels. Quite frankly, I like to listen at 75 decibels because I value long days of work. And trust me, 12 speakers or 14 speakers at 75 is plenty of sound. So the the fact is that something with the perceived loudness of about -18 coming in this format is completely different. I mean, we have to completely change the perception of loudness. Just to say that something sitting at -18, which is Dolby's recommended target for good reason, is really impactful. Like I'm talking, to me, it feels the same, I would say, as listening to a master in stereo at about -11. Like dynamic, but it's there. You're listening to something that's hitting -18 in not integrated, even in momentary loudness, -17, -18, and this many speakers. You have to understand that is powerful. That's why music, for instance, in film, we've all been to the film. I mean, that's normalized to typically around -23 LUFS. And those film scores can be epic. Now, of course, in different environments, we have different things going on that with perceived loudness, and film studios turn up their volume maybe a little too loud. So you get in a film, it's really like maybe a little too loud, to be perfectly honest, sometimes in those big IMAX theaters, but they want to impress. I digress. So just to remember that when you're in speakers, quite frankly, moving beyond -18 or -16, like it's not an instinct that you will have. And until you experience that, and you see the numbers and you see it all happening, it seems as though, wow, it's so much quieter. It's like, well, actually, quite frankly, -23 is quiet in this format. -18 is pretty robust. -16 is too loud most of the time. Now, it gets there though. It does get there. And this is where my thing. So I just want to say that I take -18 and I would equate it to, look, I'm sure someone can do this more scientifically, but as someone who masters in both formats, if I take my speakers in stereo mastering, I set it to where I master at, and a file comes in at -11, I'm going to wake up, right? We all know that feeling. You say, okay, hello. If it comes in at -9, I'm going to turn my volume knob down. So we get perspective here. At -18 is that feeling of like, oh, hello. I'm like, we're here. I sure hope this doesn't peak 4 decibels louder than this. You know what I mean? So now that we have context for just what it feels like to be in that space. So quite frankly, I have opinions on -18 on both sides. First of all, I will say -18 is the recommendation for good reason. However, it is flexible to the degree that I deliver files to universal louder and I deliver files to universal quieter. The -18 is a number that is a very easy number to essentially guarantee some things. But the more you know about the format as a mastering engineer, if you can guarantee true peak control and you can guarantee binaural control, you can deliver louder and have a very engaging master that only works for content. Like I have some hip hop music content. I mastered one last night, in fact, that I think we delivered around -17.2. Why did we deliver at -17.2? It felt awesome. It wasn't clipping the binaural. So I'm getting the maximum headroom out of the binaural before clipping. And it was still giving -1.8 as a true peak for the 5.1 render, which actually means it's going to be normalized up from there on Apple Music. So when I understand that ecosystem, and quite frankly, that's the work in mastering. Someone sends me to something, I'm still thinking about how can I get this to feel robust and engaging and full without touching any of their mix decisions. People get freaked out by stem mastering. It's like, well, you can just not touch the stems. It is a decision. And so, and I deliver that at -17.2. I've got more headroom than I need for the true peak, and I'm not touching the binaural limiter. That takes work. Takes some serious work. There's peak automation, there's targeted compression, there's lots of sidechain process, like it's all little parts across all the stems. And people say that that's mixing. Quite frankly, I don't care what we call it. The mix engineer finished it. I've been asked to master that file. And I've been asked to get this file to be perceived. And when it hits, we both had this moment last year, and this is a great mix engineer. I love working with him. He listened to it and he said, and he was the mixer for the stereo version as well. And he said, I like this one better than the stereo. And the stereo was, oh my goodness, we're talking -7, like hot. And he said, how in the world are you, getting these kick drums to feel bigger than stereo with no distortion, because there's audible distortion on the stereo one. And I was like, yeah, of course there is. If I start limiting this by 3 decibels, there's no chance for those kicks, no chance. And that's the only way you're getting there. There's only one way to go up, and that's to crush. I mean, sorry, that's an overstatement. There's harmonic and there's equalization and all of that stuff. But if you get a mix where those decisions have already been made, unless you're going to make massive adjustments to the equalization or to the harmonic content, typically one of the paths up is limiting, which comes,
it's all distortion, right? It's just different flavors. You choose one that fits musically. Absolutely. If that's what you have to do.
And so in this context, my goal, I love it. My goal is not to clip. My goal is not to cross that threshold. And some people are like, oh, I can't wait till they get a binaural limiter. I sincerely hope that they don't do that, because the fact is that what we trade in loudness and then balance with normalization, we gain space. Space is the new loud in this format. What we want, why in the world am I going to toggle to a Dolby Atmos file? Not for volume, that's for sure. I'm not going to do it to have the hardest hitting kick drum that I've ever heard in my life. I mean, you talked about challenges. It's hard. It's hard to achieve some of the things that our mastering tools achieve. So we say, well, that's where I say stereo still has, I hate the comparison that one is better or worse. Stereo is a thing, and stereo has a beautiful art to it. And it's the peak of the mountain. We all know that. The best of the world. And so, yeah, the best of the world have been in stereo and done this work. And so in Atmos, we need to look at that and take the best of it, but then also we have to redefine what our goals are. Now, someone said dynamics, no, space is the new loud. I'm not sure if that was like a thumbs up for it or a question about it.
That's because one of my catchphrases for Dynamic Range Day is "Dynamic is the new loud." So you just hijacked my catchphrase.
I hijacked you. I'm sorry. Well, but what is space though? In the sense that how do we create space is dynamics. So we're on the same team here. Perceived space is created by dynamics. For instance, I have taken binaural masters and I have tried and experimented with just limiting and stereo processing just for fun. I take the binaural render and I want to know what will happen if we get these tools. Quite frankly, it gets worse really fast. I would not, if I wanted to achieve that in stereo, I would do it a different way. I would do it through stereo processing. All of the HRTF, all of that subtlety that is trying to trick our brains to do things, it starts to fall apart so fast with a little bit of limiting and the wrong approach to equalization. It's a very specific thing. It's this delicate little Rubik's Cube, and you throw one thing off and it doesn't behave like stereo. And so what seem like limitations for those coming from stereo are just massive opportunities to be almost forced into dynamic production, into having to have dynamics just from a raw technical level. But then all of a sudden we can accept that it will be normalized and that we can trust the DSPs and the tech providers to help us to make sure that there's no massive differential between the files. And now we can still compare apples to oranges, but at least they can both be appreciated at the same time. And definitely, personally, the Atmos version, the dynamic version, the spatial version, when done properly, to me has the ability of having, and I'll just use the word equal, an equally engaging and unique experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the interesting thing. For me, the exciting thing is, so this is a spoiler for anybody who's planning to watch the webcast this evening, because I did an intro to the event today by saying that I had some things I was going to talk about. One of them is Dolby Atmos. One of them is that 90% of what we hear online is normalized, which I will talk about tonight. But the other one is the changes that Apple are making and how they're going to influence us. One of the things I'm most excited about, we just published a blog post on the Metaplugs website, because Apple have started enabling soundcheck, which is their normalization protocol, by default on new devices. So if you buy a new iPhone or a new Apple Mac today, it's going to have soundcheck enabled by default. And interestingly, that could well be because of the huge difference between Atmos and stereo, and they just don't want people to get unexpectedly blasted by super loud stereo mixes, as you mentioned. But that means, you know, Apple was the last place. Spotify have it enabled by default. Tidal have it enabled by default.
Yep.
YouTube, it's always on. So that means almost everywhere normalization is on by default. And I think I'm right in saying that when you buy an iPhone, at least, you're getting spatial audio by default. So people are going to start by hearing these binaural versions of these more dynamic mixes and masters. And I think when you take those two things, the thing that excites me about all of this, I mean, for me personally, I mean, I don't prefer every Atmos mix that I've heard. You know, there are some examples where I listen to the original stereo and I say, I would prefer that. So
Yeah.
you're absolutely right. It's not one that's better than the other. It's a question of preference. But a lot of the ones that I listen to, listening in binaural, the Atmos is very similar to the stereo, but it has more dynamics. It has less distortion, less limiting, and all the rest of it. And I personally prefer that. My hope is that over time, more and more people are going to hear those things, and they're also going to prefer it. The artists are going to prefer it. You know, the engineers and producers are going to go. I mean, you know, one of my pet theories is that, yes, people are enjoying the spatial aspects of Dolby Atmos, but I wonder whether, who knows, 30, 50% of the experience, they're also enjoying that extra dynamics because, like you say, the ability of the kick drum to just hit without distortion, all that stuff. But that's just me having my dynamic range day rant. I'm curious to know whether you've had any pushback on the fact that from clients in particular, from the fact that you're delivering, because I've heard from other engineers that there's basically an education process.
Yep.
You know, it's a question of you explain the things that you've been talking about today to them and then give them level matched files to listen to, and then they start to hear and appreciate. I think that's another thing that I'm excited about. I've always said, oh no, we shouldn't be regulating for loudness. You know, a lot of people often say to me, why don't we just say you have to master at this? And I'm kind of saying, because it's art, because you can't tell people what to do with. But the interesting thing is Dolby have done this for technical reasons. And all they're saying is, we recommend your loudest stuff is at -18. And as you say, that's really healthy in terms of loudness. So that's probably as loud as anybody needs.
Yeah, within one point, right?
Yeah.
If anything quieter has some serious merit.
Right. But the exciting thing is that people are still making the art work. You know, they just say, okay, well, that's my maximum. I'll scale everything else musically according to that. I mean, everything, you need normalization less because everything is coming in at a more consistent level anyway. I mean, Tidal, they don't normalize all the tracks to be the equal volume. They do it by album. So if they take the loudest song on an album and that's at -14. And then if there's a quieter song on the album, even in shuffle or playlist mode, you hear that song quieter and it feels musically and artistically correct. And there's research that shows that people prefer that. So the same thing is going to happen in Atmos, where if -18 is or thereabouts is the top of the scale, normalization is less necessary because all the albums are going to be more consistent to begin with. And if something is up there at -18 or even slightly louder all the way through, that's going to feel like a really loud album. And actually, if something makes use of all of this available space and has quieter songs as well and more variety, that's going to feel musically appropriate. So yeah, I'm really confused about that. But let me come back. Do you get that kind of pushback? And do you figure your way through it? Okay.
Yeah. In the initial days, as soon as Apple onboarded things, I already had relationships with some of the artists that I am working with, but I've also expanded relationships since then. You know, one of the people here in Toronto, I'm in Canada. One of the people here in Toronto who really went right into this is one of the sort of head of A&R at Universal Canada, and Sean. First of all, they built a beautiful Atmos studio in their facility, this beautiful facility that they have, and we connected because he knew about the work I was doing, and you know. What it was such a big moment for me in the sense of I was so inspired to meet someone at his level of the industry who was like, let's get the most out of this. And what is this possible? So we just got together. I showed him some music I'd worked on. We started brainstorming of projects to get done. And at that time, my responsibility with him and vice versa, my responsibility was to educate. But my responsibility was also, we had to build a sense of trust, and we also had to go into this understanding that there was some learning to be done. And look, the target is moving. One of the things about being a mastering engineer in this format is just every day, just what has changed when I wake up. I check out something on all of the DSPs every day of my own or something that I know well, just to make sure it's all the same. Because quite frankly, it's changing fast and for good reason. I mean, it's only for the better. It's only meaning to improve. But people getting in, you got to be ready for like what you thought you knew yesterday has changed today. So my responsibility there was to educate in the sense of what I would do initially is I would deliver, for some people, is a gain matched stereo master, saying, listen to these two things beside each other and then tell me your opinion, because this is how you will experience it on streaming. And if it's going to Blu-ray, it's a different thing, right? No one has loudness wars with Blu-rays because it takes time to put the disc in and put the disc out. It's not really a thing. Same with vinyl. Like, you turn your knob once. You have to make sure that your album is mastered properly in that context, but the actual output volume, you're never going to get this instantaneous thing as long as you're within the bounds of the format. And so I would do a little bit of education, but quite frankly, once as mastering engineers in stereo and immersive, whatever, our job is to have that knowledge and to provide that knowledge and to provide that confidence for people to say, you know what, this is the right loudness. When someone says, I want to make sure it's as loud, it's my job to guarantee that, right? And if I can guarantee it and they feel it that first time, then we never talk about it again. And it's beautiful. I also have a client that I worked with once where, as much as I was giving all of this information, that individual said, yeah, but I don't fully buy it. So we delivered one at minus 14.5. No binaural clipping. I wouldn't do that. I'm not going to deliver something I'm not proud of. No binaural clipping, still above the -1 true peak. That is an exercise. That is an exercise in automation, and that is an exercise in committing targeted compression. Way too much work it still sounded good. It's still on the DSPs. I wouldn't take it down, but I had to work so hard to get that file to do that. But I was like, okay, let's try it. Let's give it a go. I'm not going to say what it is.
Most people would listen to it normalized, right? So they wouldn't hear that difference anyway.
No idea. They have no idea. Zero idea. Now, again, someone says, oh my, how did you deliver? No one's going to stop you at the door for delivering a file like that. What I would say is, if I went and did it again, I think if you compared the two Atmos versions of that one song, if I was able to go back and get it at -17, I bet we'd like the -17 better. End of story. Because I would have been able to allow the kick and the bass to breathe by about 3 decibels at peak moments. And the only way around that was automation. Only way. Even compression starts to sound really 3 decibels of kick. It's lame. So I'm just literally peak automating, just drawing little smiley faces throughout the production. And it was an experiment. It's a very viable experiment. And again, it sounds good. No one knows because it's normalized. But we listen to it. I listen to it. I go back and I check it. I'm actually happy to have one out there that's like that, because I go back and I check. Is anything going on with this file? This is sort of a diamond in the rough for me of like, what's going on with this one? If this one ever starts playing back louder, I'm going to be worried. Doesn't happen. So it's just a reminder that, and again, it's not a limitation. It's not a limitation. It's the fact that there is a summing limitation. That's just end of story. That's just math. That's just volume and space. You have less space to play back the same amount of information.
It's a technical limitation, but it's a creative opportunity.
It's a creative opportunity. And when we maximize that creative opportunity and the DSPs give us the normalization practices that they are and that they're refining even better by Apple's really worked it and I think done a brilliant job already. And I know that they have little details left, like album normalization and things like that. They're still dialing in, but patience is reasonable here. What are we, 9 months, 10 months into this thing? Like, it took a lot longer for stereo. That's all I'll say. So in this regard, the dynamic potential is truly massive. And so to the degree that I think I'm well past it, I don't think about that. All I think about is, how does the music sound? And so to your point earlier about the stereo master, this is a very interesting one. I do a lot of what I refer to as spatial remixing. I don't like upmixing because it's spatial remixing to me, and spatial remastering or spatial mastering. In the idea that we're just, we're putting it in a new space. No, technically I'd call it spatial remixing and then just immersive mastering. Those are the appropriate terms for me. When it comes to the mixing part of it, here's the interesting thing. You take your stereo master, you clip gain it down, probably about 10 decibels. It comes in at -7. I'm going to put it like -17 or so. And you're like, wow, turn it down 10 decibels. You turn it down, and then I'm constantly A/Bing between those two. But what I wanted to say is when that's the goal. There are times, and I encourage them more and more, where the artist gets involved and says, well, I already have my stereo master. What else can we do? The first ones, they wanted it to be like, I want it to be just like the stereo master, but a little bigger. Like, no problem. I got you. Then the second time, they're like, okay, well, I sort of liked when the things were behind me. Maybe we can push it a little bit. And then as we're getting more and more into it, they're saying, look, I have my stereo master. This is a piece of art. It's already on the wall. Everyone's loving it. Can we do something? Can we push it a bit? Can we have a little fun? We keep using the stereo master as the reference point, but opening up the potential for more dynamics, new remixes to a degree of saying, I always wanted to hear more of that percussion, but it just wasn't working there. But maybe we can have a version that's a little bit more. So just to say that the potential there of how much the stereo master plays as the key central point, it branches out into details. It's always going to be there. And the potential, of course, of people only mixing in Atmos or mixing in Atmos first, then doing a supervised stereo mix from that Atmos. I've done this a number of times, and then mastering that to the Atmos. Now there is an interesting experience because now I'm trying to master in stereo with the space and the dynamic range of the Atmos master in mind. And it is actually encouraging me to do things like you suggest. Not that I wouldn't do those in my stereo mastering anyways. That's something I believe in, but still, all of a sudden, a little harsher, a little too bright, and a little too limited, it starts to fall down. And so there's a whole world here of like what, the chicken and the egg and who's influencing each other. And it's just being aware of it. But regardless, I do think that the dynamic potentials have already proven themselves to be valuable and will only continue to as we lean into them. It's amazing. It's just an amazing opportunity. So the last thing, I guess, is one of the big challenge when I'm doing a record. For instance, one of the last one that's up on Apple is Brandy, this record B7 by Brandy. What a record. I mean, I was listening to the stereo masters in here, just truly just freaking out. I thought it was one of the most beautiful R&B records I've heard in a long time. She sounds ridiculous. The band is on fire. Production is just off the hook. And like literally just like yelling occasionally here, be like, oh my goodness, like as if I was at a concert. Like I was so enthused. And so I'm listening to that stereo master, clip gaining it down about 10 decibels. And then constantly, the goal was definitely to like keep it in this zone. Like the master's good. Just do your thing, but like keep it in the zone. So what I'm doing is I'm constantly A/Bing it to make sure that the presence of instruments are equal. But the cool thing is that when the bass presence is equal, I actually have more dynamic range in mine. So it's all about perceived loudness at that point on individual elements. Perceived loudness is not about peak level. And quite frankly, I can achieve more perceived loudness with a more dynamic source than I can in there. So as long as I can keep everything in the range, I can keep the reins on the master. I can keep that binaural from clipping, which is not easy. I can keep everything from, doing this too much and getting my overs, which is all mixing. It's all automation. It's just gentle compression. It's all the techniques we love to use and wish we could just use all the times are like the A-list techniques here. Slow attack, fast release, just keep easing in. It's like mixing in this format is sort of mastering level techniques when you're working with good stems, if that makes sense. I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel here. I'm just trying to hold this thing in its space so I don't blow the binaural up. And I'm referencing the stereo and the cool thing is that when we get that bass, let's say as an example, or the kick feeling the same, I have significantly more dynamic range in my source than the stereo master does. And so if you can when you get that to happen, quite frankly, you toggle between the two. And also there's so much else, right? It's about like where you put your energy, where you keep things in your mix. But when you get it to lock, and it takes a lot of work to do, that's when you start toggling and it just goes like, oh my goodness, now we've got it. I've unlocked I've got the Rubik's Cube to where it needs to be to respect what's there and just have it go to the degree that I think it's as though you have the stereo master there with extra dynamic range. It's like you've expanded it, right? You've expanded it in space and you've expanded it in dynamic range. And I think that's sort of a goalpost that I keep quite regularly in my work. And it's hard, and I think it takes a mastering brain to think of, right? Because it's really about, it's about sort of stepping back and hearing things through that lens of perceived loudness and through dynamics and subtle EQ moves, nothing epic, everything's subtle. Just looking for those very graceful things that just sort of tie it all together. So anyways, I know that's a little adventure there, but I hope that explains, I think, where my own practice with these dynamics and how it's everything here. It's everything.
Yep. No, I completely agree. And we could talk about this for hours, I know, but unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there because I had to head out briefly. But thank you so much, Justin, because I think hopefully people listening will have a real idea of why I'm so excited, why I've included those Atmos mixes in the Dynamic Range Day Award this year, and why I'm optimistic. All of these things coming together, the opportunities of Atmos, the chance for artists and for consumers to hear more dynamic versions of things and to decide what they like and to maybe, move more in that direction. I really hope you're right that we start to see some of this stuff reflecting back into the stereo masters that we do, because not all of the advantages, but a good number of the advantages that we're talking about in Atmos could equally apply in stereo. It just needs the confidence, like you say, to take a step back from that extreme loudness and just give the music more room to breathe. So yeah, fantastic. For anybody watching, there will be another webcast tonight, UK time, so 10:30 p.m. GMT. I forget what, if you head over to dynamicrangeday.com and click the live button on the menu, the YouTube videos there, if you click on those, it'll tell you when those are going to show up in your time zone, wherever you are in the world. Please head over, join us there. I will be announcing the winner of the award, including some Atmos albums. We're going to talk some more about the Apple move that I mentioned there, and also this. I'm pretty sure it's proof that about 90% of what anybody hears online is normalized these days. So nobody is hearing super loud stuff. And yeah, if you're liking what you're hearing and enjoying the ideas, please, there are memes on the Dynamic Range Day Facebook page and Twitter feed. There's the blog post about Apple turning normalization on by default. There's a ton of stuff out there. Please tell everybody, help spread the word, because hopefully by making more people aware of this stuff, we can start to open some minds. And like you say, we can grasp those opportunities and let the music do what it needs to do best, focus on the music rather than on the technicalities.
Thank you so much, Ian. Such a pleasure and an honor. I love what you do. I'm such a huge fan of what the music that you make, and also just what you bring to our community. And so thank you for having me.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. And anybody watching this, if you need any immersive mastering, then immersivemastering.com, right?
That's it. Thank you.
Is the website. And yeah, talk to Justin. He'll be able to help you out.
And there are also playlists there. If anyone wants to listen to some of the records, you can click on Tidal, Amazon, or Apple and go visit and listen to some music. That is what it's all about in the end.
Fantastic. Thanks, Justin. Thanks, everybody, for being here. And we'll see you later.
Okay, bye.